What if I told you that the man who changed the course of English history forever wasn't just a king obsessed with producing a male heir, but someone whose private chambers harbored secrets so twisted they would make even modern tabloids blush? Henry VIII, you think you know from textbooks and Hollywood films, is sanitized fiction compared to the reality of what went on behind closed palace doors. We've all heard the simplified version: fat king, 6 wives, chopped off a few heads, broke from Rome. But that narrative barely scratches the surface of a man whose personal appetites and private behaviors were so extreme they shocked even his own courtiers. These were people accustomed to medieval brutality, yet they whispered in horror about their sovereign's true nature. Today, we're diving deep into the disturbing reality of Henry's private world, and I'm warning you now, what you're about to discover will forever change how you think about England's most notorious monarch. This isn't just about his marriages or his politics. This is about the man himself, the predator who lurked beneath the crown, whose personal obsessions twisted an entire kingdom to serve his darkest impulses. But before we expose the shocking truth about Henry's private life, we need to understand how he became the monster history tried to forget. Because the young prince who ascended to the throne in 1509 bore little resemblance to the creature he would eventually become. Picture this: 18-year-old Henry Tudor, 6 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5. Golden-haired, athletic, fluent in multiple languages, and blessed with the kind of charisma that made grown men weep in his presence. Contemporary accounts describe him as the most beautiful prince in all of Christendom, a Renaissance ideal made flesh. But even in those early days, there were warning signs that those closest to him chose to ignore. His tutors noted an unsettling cruelty in how he treated servants who displeased him. His childhood games often involved elaborate scenarios where he held absolute power over life and death. Most telling of all, he displayed an almost pathological need to be the center of attention at all times, flying into violent rages when anyone dared overshadow him. The first real glimpse of Henry's twisted private nature emerged during his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. History portrays their early years as a fairy tale romance, but palace records tell a very different story. Catherine's ladies-in-waiting left detailed accounts of the king's increasingly bizarre demands in the royal bedchamber, rituals that combined religious symbolism with acts so degrading they couldn't be spoken of openly. Henry's obsession with virginity bordered on the pathological. He required detailed physical examinations of every woman who entered his service, conducted by royal physicians who were sworn to secrecy under pain of death. These weren't medical necessities, but expressions of his need to control and possess every aspect of the women around him. But it was his treatment of Catherine during her multiple pregnancies and miscarriages that revealed the true depth of his depravity. Rather than showing compassion for his wife's suffering, Henry seemed to derive a sick pleasure from her pain. Courtiers reported him making cruel jokes about her failed pregnancies, referring to her lost children as divine punishment for her supposed sins. The king's private apartments became a theater of psychological torture. He would force Catherine to witness his increasingly public flirtations with her own ladies-in-waiting, orchestrating elaborate humiliations designed to break her spirit. When she miscarried their son in 1511, Henry reportedly told her it was God's judgment on their marriage, then immediately began planning a feast to celebrate his newfound freedom to pursue other women. This pattern of cruelty toward the women in his life would only intensify as Henry's power grew absolute. His courtiers learned to supply him with a constant stream of young women, understanding that their own survival depended on satisfying the king's increasingly twisted appetites. These weren't just political marriages or casual affairs we're talking about. These were systematic campaigns of psychological and physical domination that left a trail of broken lives in their wake. The royal court developed an entire underground network dedicated to facilitating Henry's private obsessions. Trusted servants would scout convents, noble houses, even common taverns, seeking women who fit the king's very specific physical requirements. They looked for innocence that could be corrupted, beauty that could be possessed, and most importantly, vulnerability that could be exploited. Henry's private collection of what he called his precious things offers perhaps the most disturbing insight into his true nature. Hidden away in a secret chamber within his private apartments, he kept detailed journals describing every woman who had ever caught his interest. These weren't romantic love letters, but clinical catalogs of physical attributes, personal weaknesses, and detailed plans for psychological manipulation. The entries read like a predator's hunting notes. He recorded everything from their monthly cycles to their deepest fears, information gathered by his network of spies and informants. Most chilling of all, he kept physical tokens from each encounter: locks of hair, pieces of jewelry, even more intimate items that served as trophies of his conquests. But Henry's private perversions extended beyond his treatment of women. His relationship with food became increasingly ritualistic and disturbing as his reign progressed. Court records describe elaborate private feasts where he would consume massive quantities of meat while forcing courtiers to watch him eat. These weren't simple displays of gluttony, but carefully orchestrated performances designed to demonstrate his power over life and death. The king developed a particular fascination with watching animals being slaughtered for his meals. He would have live cattle, pigs, and deer brought into the palace courtyard where he could observe their deaths while dining. Witnesses described his obvious excitement during these spectacles, how his breathing would quicken and his pupils would dilate as the blood began to flow. His private chambers were decorated with increasingly macabre artwork depicting scenes of violence and domination. Tapestries showed biblical massacres in graphic detail, while paintings commissioned specifically for his personal viewing portrayed mythological scenes of rape and torture. These weren't typical royal decorations, but the carefully curated environment of someone who fed on others' suffering. The transformation of Henry's physical appearance during these middle years of his reign reflected the darkness consuming his soul. The beautiful young prince began to bloat and distort, his once handsome features twisting into something grotesque. But this wasn't simply the result of overeating and lack of exercise. Court physicians noted strange marks and scars appearing on his body, evidence of private rituals and self-inflicted punishments that he never allowed anyone to witness. His personal hygiene, once impeccable, deteriorated dramatically. He would go weeks without bathing, claiming that the stench of his own body brought him closer to understanding the sufferings of Christ. But those brave enough to approach him during these periods described an odor that went beyond simple uncleanliness. It was the smell of something rotting from within, a physical manifestation of the corruption eating away at his humanity. The king's sleep patterns became increasingly erratic and disturbing. Night guards reported hearing strange sounds coming from the royal bedchamber, not snoring or normal sleep disturbances, but what sounded like conversations with invisible companions. Sometimes he would scream out names of people he had executed years earlier, carrying on arguments with the dead that could last for hours. During these nocturnal episodes, Henry would often summon servants to his chamber, not for any practical purpose, but simply to have living witnesses to his power. He would force them to stand perfectly still while he paced around them, touching their faces, examining their teeth like livestock, all while muttering about the divine right of kings to possess whatever they desired. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how Henry's private obsessions began to reshape the entire structure of English society. His need for absolute control over every aspect of human sexuality led to increasingly draconian laws governing marriage, adultery, and even private consensual relationships between adults. These weren't just religious reforms, but the systematic implementation of one man's twisted psychology as national policy. The reach of Henry's private pathologies extended into every corner of his kingdom through a web of informants and enforcers who carried out his most disturbing personal vendettas. The king established what he privately called his moral guardians, trusted agents whose sole purpose was to monitor the private lives of his subjects and report back anything that might feed his voyeuristic appetites. These weren't official positions recorded in any court documents. They were shadow roles filled by men who understood that their survival depended on satisfying Henry's increasingly bizarre curiosity about the intimate details of other people's lives. They would infiltrate households, seduce servants for information, even pose as priests to hear confessions that would later be whispered directly into the king's ear during his private audiences. Henry's fascination with the private sufferings of others became legendary among those close enough to witness it firsthand. He would demand detailed reports about executions he didn't personally attend, requiring descriptions so graphic that even hardened executioners found themselves uncomfortable providing them. But it wasn't enough to simply hear about death and torture. He needed to understand the psychological journey of his victims, their final thoughts, their moments of despair and terror. The king developed an elaborate system for categorizing different types of suffering, keeping meticulous notes about which methods of punishment produced the most satisfying emotional responses from their subjects. He would compare the reactions of nobles versus commoners, men versus women, young versus old, treating human agony like a scholar might study different species of insects. His private collection expanded beyond personal trophies to include detailed artistic renderings of his enemies' final moments. Court artists who refused these commissions found themselves quickly out of favor, while those who could capture the precise expression of terror in a condemned man's eyes were richly rewarded. These paintings were displayed in a private gallery that only Henry was permitted to enter, where he would spend hours studying the faces of those whose lives he had destroyed. The psychological toll on Henry's immediate circle became increasingly apparent as his reign progressed. Servants who had once competed for positions close to the king now actively sought assignments that would keep them as far from his presence as possible. Those forced to attend him in his private chambers developed nervous conditions, stammers, and other stress-related ailments that physicians couldn't explain through conventional medicine. Catherine Parr, his final wife, left coded diary entries that provide perhaps our clearest window into the daily horror of living intimately with Henry during his final years. She describes nights when he would force her to listen to detailed confessions of his past cruelties, not seeking absolution, but rather reliving them for his own twisted pleasure. He would recount the exact words his previous wives had spoken before their executions, imitating their voices with disturbing accuracy. The king's relationship with physical pain became increasingly complex and disturbing during this period. His famous leg ulcers, rather than being simply medical ailments, seemed to provide him with a perverse form of satisfaction. Court physicians noted his reluctance to accept effective treatments, preferring remedies that would prolong his suffering rather than heal it. He would spend hours examining his wounds, describing the sensations to anyone forced to listen. But Henry's most disturbing private ritual involved what he called his divine communications. Several times each week, he would retreat to a specially constructed chamber deep within the palace where no servants were permitted to follow. What occurred during these sessions remained a mystery to everyone except Henry himself, but the sounds that emerged painted a terrifying picture. Guards stationed outside reported hearing the king's voice engaged in animated conversations, sometimes pleading, sometimes commanding, always with an intensity that suggested genuine belief in the presence of otherworldly visitors. These weren't simple prayers, but complex dialogues where Henry seemed to be receiving specific instructions about how to conduct his earthly affairs. The content of these supposed divine messages invariably involved increasingly creative forms of cruelty toward his subjects. After each session, Henry would emerge with new ideas for laws, punishments, or personal vendettas that seemed designed more to satisfy his psychological needs than serve any practical purpose of governance. His courtiers learned to dread these periods, knowing they would inevitably result in fresh waves of arrests, executions, and psychological torment for anyone unlucky enough to attract the king's attention. So there you have it. The disturbing truth about Henry VIII's private world? A reality so twisted that history itself conspired to bury it. This wasn't just a king with unusual appetites or political ambitions. This was a predator who wielded absolute power to feed his darkest impulses, transforming an entire kingdom into his personal hunting ground. The next time you see that iconic portrait of Henry VIII, remember what truly lurked behind those calculating eyes.